The disunited states of America. As the presidential election result hangs in the balance, supporters of Donald Trump and Joe Biden are growing impatient. Regardless of who wins, can Americans heal their divided nation? This is Inside Story. Hello and welcome to the program. I'm Imran Khan. The US presidential race is tightening. Democratic challenger Joe Biden is inching towards removing Donald Trump from the White House. The results depend on just a few states where only thousands of votes separate the two candidates. Biden's confident he'll emerge the winner. Trump's campaign is seeking legal action for a recount in Wisconsin, and his team is suing to stop the count in some states, alleging the election is being stolen. The dispute has triggered extraordinary scenes in a country that often calls itself the greatest democracy on earth.
Count! 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 Count every vote!
From coast to coast, people rallied to demand every vote be counted. The large number of mail-in ballots is complicating the process. Demonstrators also highlighted issues that flared up during Trump's presidency, such as racism and police brutality. But Trump supporters in some states want the count to stop. In Arizona, police had to block the entrance to a counting center when protesters carrying guns gathered outside. A survey for US media found the election has widened social divisions. People largely voted along the same political lines as 2016.
It really does seem like people live in two different realities, given the news they consume and who they surround themselves with. So I'm not that surprised that a lot of people decided to vote again for a president who's brought us to where we are.
We want everyone to have the same rights and the same opportunities, and we see that in an America that Biden and Harris are both running together.
It don't matter if Trump wins or Biden wins. We still gonna have people pulling their guns out on black men because they're scared of them because of their color before they're scared of them because of what they had.
I think we should have an answer by now. I don't understand why it's taking so long, and I think there's going to be trouble either way. Someone is not going to be happy about it, so they're going to want that recount.
Let's bring in our guest. Jotaka Eaddy is a political strategist and former senior advisor to the National Association for the Advancement of Colored People. She joins us from Washington, D.C. Joining us from Reston, Virginia, is conservative political strategist Rina Shah, and also in Washington, D.C., Elisabeth Anker, Associate Professor of American Studies and Political Science at George Washington University. A welcome to each of you. I want to begin in Washington, D.C. With Jotaka Eaddy. Let's talk about the divide within the U.S. Now, it's not a daily political divide anymore. It seems to be much more ideological than that. And it seems to be rooted in police violence, in racism. It seems to be rooted in the economy and the handling of the coronavirus crisis. Would you suggest that this is the most divisive that you've seen American society?
Well, as a student of political science and history, I do believe that there have been times in our country when we've been more divided. But I do believe for this moment in our nation that we are deeply divided. I think that many people woke up on Wednesday morning, despite the fact that there has not been an answer on who will lead our country, although I think many believe that Vice President Biden is in a very strong position, that many people were disappointed that there is this deep divide, that more than nearly half of America decided to vote for a candidate that has been deeply aligned with racism and sexism and homophobia and xenophobia, and that there was a decision in this country by many people to side with that type of ideal. And I believe that there's a lot of work for us to do in this country to reconcile. There's still a lot of work for us to do to truly get to a place of healing. And I think also that is deeply disheartening when you think about the massive amount of outpouring of protest and conversation in the aftermath of the murder of George Floyd and Breonna Taylor, that we still find ourselves in a place where Americans will still side with someone who believes that they're good people on both sides of a white supremacist rally.
Rina Shah in Reston, Virginia, you're a conservative political strategist. You're at great pains to actually tell us that you don't support Donald Trump, but you do support the Republican Party. Now, that's another divide that we'll get into in just a second. But what I want to ask you is this. Has Donald Trump just opened up the fissures that were already there in American society? He's just laid them bare for all to see now, surely.
There's no doubt that so much of what we see now on the surface, this, these angry calls for my guy or the other guy, this divide really has been brewing for quite some time. We know these fissures have been there, as you said, but this was a time with Trump's election. I think it brought it all to the surface in such a manner that maybe so many of us who've been inside the Beltway for many years and witnessed bipartisanship. I started my career on Capitol Hill in the House of Representatives, working for two very far-right members of Congress. And I ultimately left there because my views did not align with theirs. And I made a decision that I wanted to work for members that I could really get behind. And I left for the campaign trail because I also had that bug. But what I witnessed on Capitol Hill and why I bring it up is because bipartisanship was at the heart of everything we did. You couldn't get things done in Congress unless you reached across the aisle. And so, like I said, for so many of us who've been part of this ruling class, as the outsiders call it, the establishment, it was not a bad thing to be here and be part of the great American experiment. In fact, it was a beautiful thing to witness. But where we've come to is a moment that I think we did not expect. It's come far quicker than we expected. The divide widened, it deepened at a faster rate and far deeper again than we thought. So this is a moment of fundamental sadness, I think, for many Americans who really believe in our system. We do see our electoral process at work, and it is healthy and it's alive and it's working. But the sadness really comes from seeing other parts break down due to the president's rhetoric this past 4 years. His handling of things has led to a distrust in our institutions, disinformation being promulgated from the highest levels of our government. That is something that I know the average Republican in their heart of hearts, no matter how they voted on election day or prior, I know that, again, it creates deep sadness because this is just not who we are as Americans.
Elisabeth, Anker in Washington, D.C. Rina Shah says the Republicans aren't to blame. She's saying that actually in the heart of hearts, they're actually good people. But they did support Donald Trump. They did put him into power. And here we are 4 years later with a very divisive nation. What are your thoughts on how this has happened?
Well, a lot of these divides are long-standing. But one of the things that we have seen in recent years, and especially in the rhetoric of Trump, which has, catalyzed a large part of the Republican Party, though not all of it, is the way in which political opposition has turned into a kind of enemy rhetoric at the highest levels, a kind of turning political, just political antagonism into a kind of existential antagonism, a life or death language. And I think that's part of the reason that we see people unable to bridge some of these bipartisan divides anymore, because people who were previously seen as working on the other side with differences of opinion are now seen as enemies to be eradicated. We see this in a lot of Trump's language. He is never speaking about unity. He is always speaking about division and violence and trying to recreate a we the people that is a primarily white we, a very masculinized we at that as well. And so I think even though these divides have been longstanding, we need to see that Trump has galvanized them, and he has galvanized a large part of the Republican Party alongside of him, something that we've seen in these polls where people expected a lot more people to side with Joe Biden, and we're just not seeing that kind of routing of Donald Trump like we might have expected.
Jotaka, let me bring you in here. We were never going to see a routing of Donald Trump because of the way the electoral college system is set up and the way Americans vote. But what a lot of Democrats were hoping for, that there was going to be a repudiation of what Donald Trump stood for. That hasn't happened. Now, where do the Democrats go from here? Like, how do they unite this ideologically, not just politically, ideologically divided nation?
I think that we have to focus on just what is at the center of our country, which is our values. And as the other panelists have shared, is that we had for the last 4 years a president that has just over and over again used hateful rhetoric and stoked rhetoric. A lot of places across the country, a lot of these communities are in dire need of attention. These are people, I believe that there's a lot of fear. There's a lot of hurt. And where you stoke that type of rhetoric, you begin to seed hate where there's fear or misunderstanding. And I believe that is what Donald Trump has consistently done. And I believe that where the Democrats and where Vice President Biden will have to go is really where this campaign has been centered, is really at the soul of America. And fundamentally putting at the center of everything is a healing of America, bringing America together, focusing on fixing so much of that is broken in this country, focusing on an economy, focusing on our healthcare system, focusing on fixing this global pandemic. Because where there is pain in our country, that is where people can use that pain and seep in hatred and fear. And that is what Donald Trump has done. And I believe that the Democrats have an opportunity and will focus on healing and bringing people together, because Joe Biden recognizes that as a president of the United States, that he's a president of all America. That is something that, Donald Trump has not done. He is not focused on being a president of all America. He focused on being a president of part of America and stoking hatred and violence in much of our country, which has been very dangerous.
Rina Shah, let me bring you in here. It's an interesting point that is being made, that Joe Biden will try and heal the nation. Whether he succeeds or not, he needs to be in power first. But there is a significant chunk of the Republican Party who are going to take a look at what Donald Trump did over the last 4 years and go, you know what, it worked. We're only losing this election at the moment by hundreds of thousands of votes. There are people that buy into his philosophy. As a Republican strategist, that must, particularly one who doesn't like Donald Trump particularly, that must scare you.
Yes, like I said earlier, I had my career at a time where the party was very different. These past 4 years have been extremely difficult for me because I was the first ever Republican National Convention delegate to speak out against the now president. And I suffered the consequences back in 2016, far before a great many people were really figured out who Donald Trump was and how he would operate, along with his people and how they operate. I felt it was very mafia-like. Very un-American. They were trying to silence dissidents, those of us who didn't agree with this president's nomination. And so in seeing that back then and seeing what's come forth from the party since then, I remain in a place of profound confusion of how we got here so fast. That is really probably at the core of everything I'm thinking in this week, is because these election results, while I expected them to be quite close, I knew that the party's been remade in the president's image, I didn't expect for it to go this way. I expected for a repudiation of Trump because of what he's actually done.
But Rina, let me just put this to you. You just said there that the party has been remade in the president's image. Unmaking that, given it's so close, given he has half the nation, is going to be next to impossible, surely?
Surely it will be, because the Never Trump crowd, like I said, I belong to, I really, when I stepped out to do what I did, I believed that, okay, this might take a while, but surely people will wake up. And especially in a year like this year, where we see the failings of the president, where we see over 230,000 of our fellow Americans dead, 250,000 Americans dead, and the lack of empathy, the lack of leadership, the lack of a plan. I think that is where there's a real confusion among those of us who believe that our Republican Party members were perhaps better than this, that they would reject him at the polls when they see that it was a strong economy he inherited from Obama. He was gifted the economy. He didn't do it himself. These were Obama-era policies. The facts have really should speak for themselves, but they have not. And we're at the point where I tell you, in the year 2021, the way the election day went, the Republican Party is going to have more members of QAnon conspiracy theory folks. I mean, these are going to be members of the House of Representatives. They're going to have more members of QAnon than they're going to have African Americans. That tells you everything you need to know right there. There's not been an acceptance of what has gone wrong. There's been nothing but an embrace of what I would call a dear leader. And that's dangerous. It's un-American. And what we also witnessed from the president in the early morning hours after Election Day, Wednesday morning, he gets up and gives this incredibly nonsensical, illogical, laden with falsities speech, saying things that are absolutely untrue. It was so un-American.
Well, let's bring in Elisabeth.
Elizabeth.
I want to bring in Elisabeth Anker here. Elisabeth, the dear leader strategy, it is something that is extraordinary to watch when you are non-American like I am, and to think, wow, this is happening in the United States. But it's working, and there are Republicans who are going to continue Donald Trump's strategy, whether he's in power or not, because it's working, it's getting votes. Do you think that's ever going to change?
One of the things that we have seen is, a pretty high correlation of people who support Donald Trump to people who are also quite comfortable with authoritarianism, and people who are threatened by real forms of democracy, which means all people across the racial, gender, religious spectrum exercising power. And so given how strong the correlations are between Trump and authoritarianism, and even the way in which he galvanizes that kind of authoritarianism among people, right? As we see a lot of his supporters say, they're not even interested in term limits. They're happy to have him be president for life. They kind of worship everything that he says. I do think that's what is leading this incredibly kind of dangerous moment in U.S. politics, because it's not only support for one leader and demonization of members of the American polity, but it's also this sense that democracy is unvaluable altogether. And one of the things we're going to see right now, especially that we've seen since 2018, and I think with this new Congress as well, is we are seeing a rise of women, of people of color who are exercising power, and the power that is rightfully theirs and power that has often been denied them under the American political system. So for people who are invested in Trump's authoritarianism, just seeing this kind of democratic exercise of power by other members of the polity that they believe should not have that power ends up seeming threatening and even feeling to them like a form of oppression. And I think that this dynamic is something that we need to pay careful attention to, because if this kind of authoritarianism and anti-democratic sentiment doesn't get toned down by Republicans within the party, I think that's something that can lead to some dangers ahead, even when Trump is out of office.
Well, actually, it's interesting you mention the idea that there are women of colour in positions of power now. Let's talk about the squad. They are famous in the US. You've got Cortez, you have Omar, who have been re-elected back. These are the women who might be able to change or certainly lead the fight against people like QAnon people who are now in power. Jotaka, let me just ask you, is it down to a resistance that's equally powerful and ideological in its own way to fight back against the ideology of the Republicans?
I think it's absolutely necessary. There's a necessary need for resistance. There's a necessary need to push back. There's a necessary need to be bold in this moment. Again, we are at a struggle for the fundamental soul of America in this country. And to the point that was made, Black women have been incredible in this moment. Black women have always led, often led without getting the due credit that they have deserved for what they have done for this nation and for the country and for the Democratic Party for that much. But what we saw in this election, we saw Black women in and around every aspect of this election, even with Kamala Harris on the ticket, at the top of the ticket. You saw Black women in county after county and city after city, where these razor thin margins, the margin of victory, when it's all said and done, we'll see that it was Black women who really shepherded this country and this election really on their backs and carried this nation across the finish line. And we see a record number of Black women that were up and down the ticket, and we see them winning. but we will also see them leading in this very pivotal moment in the country. And I think that is what's needed. And I think that's going to be the jolt that's actually going to heal us and bring us all together.
We are running out of time, but I do want to come to Elisabeth and to Rina Shah. I'll begin with Rina. Rina, are we about to see a much more divisive House, a much more divisive politics? People are going to look at the Republican Party and say, well, actually, they are too far to the right now, so we need to be too far to the left in order to get our voices heard. Instead of coming together, we are going to see, in the next 4 years, a lot more division, because simply that's the way American politics have gone.
I would certainly hope not. The way the political winds are looking, look, that blue wave that was talked about did not come, and that's kind of a hard thing for people to sort of first pick up their heads and sort of understand, is that what's going to happen now, the balance of power is going to look very different. I think with Biden in the White House, we'll see somebody who at least is very comfortable using the levers of power. And Trump never quite got comfortable with that, I believe, never really knew how to do that properly. And there were many in his administration who said he just didn't know how to govern. So instead of looking at Congress, which has had such low approval ratings from the American people in modern history, and instead of even looking at the executive branch, I think we will find a way within the next year to start to heal ourselves as a nation. There are so many great initiatives happening nationwide that are run by younger people and older people of all types who are looking and saying something's wrong here. We need greater civic literacy. We need to talk about the moral courage it takes to step out and do the right thing. I mean, I cannot believe the reports I'm reading since in the past 2 days of Republicans privately being disgusted and horrified at the president's remarks on election night and how he's conducted himself since then. But what it takes is the moral courage. We need to have conversations.
Sorry, Rina, we are running out of time, and I do want to bring in Elisabeth Anker here as well. Well, Elisabeth, it's interesting that Rina Shah says there were Republicans privately disgusted with the president's remarks, but they didn't come out and publicly say it because clearly there's votes in it. What I want to ask you is the same question I asked Rina Shah. Are we about to see a much more, in the next 4 years, divisive nature because of hardline stances being taken by the Republican Party on the far right and by the Democratic Party on the far left?
But, I think it depends on what we mean by divided nation, because one thing we see is that a lot of the, not just kind of mainstream Democratic policies, but a lot of policies on the progressive side of the Democrats are actually about bringing in more people. They are about fighting for democracy. They're about extending civil rights. They're about supporting women's bodily autonomy. So a lot of these policies are actually not about dividing people. They are about extending protections, rights, and power to people who have often been unjustly denied them. So to me, those kinds of policies are actually not divisive, they are inclusive. The question is whether other people, especially the Republicans on the far right, will see those claims for greater power, greater inclusivity, and greater protections as either threats to their own power, as threats to their notion of who the people are, or as something that needs to be blocked at all levels. So I think if we start to see real pushback against a lot of these inclusive kinds of policies and a continued kind of greater support for a form of anti-democratic authoritarianism, that's where we might see a divide happening. But once again, when we think about the George Floyd protests over the summer, those protests were the largest protests in U.S. history. They were in all 50 states. They had thousands and thousands and tens of millions of people supporting them. And they were Black-led, but they were also multiracial, multi-ethnic, multi-religious, multi-generational. And so to me, that kind of broad inclusiveness about people who are fighting for greater inclusiveness to stop violence against marginalized people, that to me shows that there can be policies that are not about dividing, but about uniting people around greater equality and greater freedom for everyone.
I want to thank all our guests for a very interesting debate. Jotaka, Eaddy, Rina Shah and Elisabeth Anker. And thank you too for watching. We'll have full coverage of the US election results on air and online at aljazeera.com. Now, for further discussion, you can go to our Facebook page. That's facebook.com/AJ Inside Story. And you can also join the conversation on Twitter. We are at AJ Inside Story. From me, Imran Khan, and the whole team here in Doha, bye for now.